Welcome to the deep dive, where we dig into the stuff you send us and try to pull out the most interesting and shocking and thought-provoking points. And today we're going deep on a topic that is, I don't know about you, but to me it's both fascinating and terrifying, the history of forced sterilization and eugenics programs here in the United States. It's heavy stuff for sure, but it's also, I think, incredibly important to understand. Our main source today is a blog post from PBS called Unwanted Sterilization and Eugenics Programs in the United States. And to help us navigate this sensitive and complex topic, I've got an expert with me. What do you say we just jump right in?
Let's dive in.
Okay, so first, let's just kind of set the stage. This blog post talks about the eugenics movement. For those who might not be, totally familiar with it, can you give us a quick overview of what that was all about?
Sure. So eugenics was essentially a movement that was based on this idea that you could improve the human population by controlling who was able to reproduce. And it was, very often rooted in racist and ableist beliefs. It targeted marginalized groups who were deemed unfit to have children.
Yeah, it's really chilling when you think about it, this idea of deciding who gets to have a family based on these completely, arbitrary standards.
Absolutely.
Oh.
And what's even more disturbing is how widespread this movement actually was. The PBS Post points out that 32 states in the U.S. actually had federally funded sterilization programs throughout the 20th century.
32 states. That's
Yeah.
mind-blowing. I had no idea it was that pervasive.
Yeah.
And the Post mentions that over 60,000 people were sterilized under these programs.
Yes. And one of the most alarming aspects of this is the specific groups that were targeted by these programs: immigrants, people of color, people living in poverty, people with disabilities, unmarried mothers, those deemed mentally ill. They were all deemed unfit to reproduce by the standards of the eugenics movement.
It's heartbreaking the way these already vulnerable groups were targeted and dehumanized.
Exactly. It was a systematic attempt to control and limit entire populations.
Yeah.
And one of the most potent examples of this is the case of Buck v. Bell.
Right. The PBS Post talks about that case, which went all the way to the Supreme Court in 1927.
Yes. And the court's decision in that case was truly horrifying. They actually upheld the constitutionality of forced sterilization, which paved the way for thousands more sterilizations.
Yeah, and the quote from Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. in that ruling is just bone-chilling. He wrote, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." It's hard to even comprehend the callousness of that statement.
Yeah, that quote really encapsulates the eugenic mindset of the time. It's a stark reminder of how dangerous these ideas can be when they gain a foothold in the legal system.
Absolutely. And speaking of chilling, I was really struck by the information in the Post about Hitler actually praising the U.S. for his early eugenics efforts. It puts things into a terrifying perspective.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. Hitler actually saw the U.S. as a model for his own, twisted vision of racial purity. The Post quotes him as saying, "There is today one state in which at least weak beginnings toward a better conception of citizenship are noticeable. Of course, it is not our model German Republic, but the United States."
It's almost unbelievable, isn't it, to think that the U.S. played a role, even if indirectly, in shaping Nazi ideology. It really underscores the gravity and the global impact of these ideas.
It's a stark reminder that we can't afford to just dismiss eugenics as simply a dark chapter of the past. The ideology behind it is still present in various forms today, and we need to be very vigilant in recognizing and challenging it.
So true. And speaking of the lasting impact of these programs, the PBS Post goes on to discuss how this wasn't just about abstract ideas. It had devastating consequences for real people's lives.
Absolutely. And one of the most disturbing aspects of these programs was the often deceptive and abusive methods they used.
Right. The Post mentions this term Mississippi appendectomies, which sounds utterly terrifying. Can you explain what that refers to?
Sure. So it's essentially a euphemism for the forced sterilization of Black women, often under the guise of other medical procedures. So they would go in for what they thought was an appendectomy, and they would come out having been sterilized without their consent or knowledge. It was a truly horrifying practice that was prevalent, particularly in the South. And it speaks volumes about the exploitation and medical abuse that Black women faced.
It's just horrifying to think that this was happening in hospitals, places that are meant for healing, and it really highlights the intersection of race and class in this whole eugenics movement.
Exactly, and it's a tragic reminder that these abuses often targeted the most vulnerable members of society.
Absolutely. The Post also touches on the forced sterilization of Native American women, with estimates that 25 to 50% of Native women were sterilized between 1970 and 1976. It's a staggering statistic.
Yes, the scale of these programs and the lasting impact that they had on generations is truly difficult to grasp. But it's crucial that we try to understand the full scope of this history and the ways that it continues to affect communities today.
Definitely.
Yeah.
The Post briefly touches on the case of Ralphie Weinberger, which is another just heartbreaking example of the exploitation of vulnerable populations.
Yes. This case involved two young black sisters, Mary Alice and Minnie Ralph, who were sterilized without their knowledge or consent. Their mother was illiterate, and she was tricked into signing a form that she thought authorized birth control shots for her daughters. But it wasn't until later that she realized that her daughters had actually been sterilized.
It's sickening to think that someone could exploit a parent's trust like that, especially when the daughters were mentally disabled and couldn't fully comprehend what was happening to them.
Exactly. It's a clear example of the power imbalances and the systemic racism that fueled these programs. And this case ultimately exposed a much wider problem because the lawsuit that was filed on behalf of the Ralph sisters revealed that somewhere between 100,000 to 150,000 poor people were being sterilized each year under federally funded programs.
It's a horrifying statistic, and it makes you wonder how many other cases like this went unreported or unnoticed.
Yeah, it's a tragic reality that we may never know the true extent of the damage done by these programs.
And sadly, even though these programs were officially ended, their legacy continues to haunt us.
That's right. The trauma that was inflicted on these individuals and their families is immeasurable. And it's not just about the past. The PBS post makes it clear that these issues are still relevant today, connecting the forced sterilization programs to contemporary debates about reproductive rights and access to health care, particularly for marginalized communities.
Yeah, it's like history is repeating itself in some ways, with continued attempts to control women's bodies and limit their reproductive choices.
Unfortunately, yes. We still see attempts to control women's bodies and limit their reproductive choices, especially for women of color and low-income women.
Yeah, it's a crucial reminder that the fight for reproductive justice is far from over.
Indeed. And this brings us to the larger issue of reproductive justice, which is about more than just the legal right to an abortion. The PBS Post highlights the work of organizations like the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health, which are fighting for a broader understanding of reproductive rights.
So it's about ensuring that all people, regardless of their background or circumstances, have the resources and the support to make informed decisions about their reproductive lives.
Exactly. It's about having control over your own body, your own choices, and your own future. And that includes access to affordable birth control, comprehensive sex education, and quality health care for all.
It's about dismantling the systems of oppression that have historically limited these choices for marginalized communities.
Precisely. And it's a fight that requires us to understand the historical context, the legal precedents, and the ongoing struggles that marginalized communities face.
Yeah, it's a lot to process, but it's essential information. And I think it's time to maybe shift gears a bit and look at some of the legal battles that have been fought in the wake of these programs.
That sounds like a good plan.
The PBS Post briefly mentions the Eugenics Compensation Act, which was passed in 2015.
Yes. This was a significant, albeit belated step towards acknowledging the harm done by these programs. It authorized compensation for surviving victims of forced sterilization, although sadly many states were slow to actually implement it.
But it's still a powerful symbol of accountability
Yeah.
and an attempt to provide some measure of justice for those who suffered under these policies.
Absolutely. It's a recognition that these actions were wrong and that the government has a responsibility to make amends.
Right. It's about acknowledging the past and taking concrete steps towards a more just future.
And this brings us to another important point, the ongoing fight for reproductive justice. Even though forced sterilization programs have officially ended, the struggle for bodily autonomy and reproductive freedom continues.
The PBS Post highlights this by connecting the historical context to contemporary issues like access to abortion and birth control. It's a reminder that the fight for reproductive justice is multifaceted and intersects with issues of race, class, and gender.
Exactly. It's about ensuring that all people have the resources and the support they need to make informed decisions about their bodies and their reproductive lives.
And that includes access to quality health care, comprehensive sex education, and affordable reproductive services. It's about dismantling the systems of oppression that have historically limited these choices for marginalized communities.
And it's about recognizing that reproductive justice is a fundamental human right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a right that must be protected and defended for all, regardless of their race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, or any other factor.
Now, shifting gears a bit, let's delve into a specific aspect of the source material that I found particularly insightful. The PBS Post does a great job of highlighting the connection between eugenics and immigration.
Right. It mentions how anti-immigrant sentiment fueled many of these sterilization programs, especially in California.
Exactly. There was this fear that immigrants, particularly those from Asia and Latin America, would somehow dilute the purity of the American gene pool. It's just another layer of racism and xenophobia that permeated these policies.
Yeah, and this fear was often intertwined with economic anxieties, with some
Yeah.
arguing that immigrants were a drain on society and that limiting their reproduction would protect American jobs and resources. It's a classic example of scapegoating and using marginalized groups to deflect from larger societal problems.
You're absolutely right. And this connection between eugenics and immigration has disturbing implications for contemporary debates about border control and immigration reform. It's crucial to recognize how these historical prejudices can resurface in modern political discourse.
Absolutely. We need to be vigilant in challenging any policies or rhetoric that echo these harmful ideologies.
Yeah, I completely agree. We've covered a lot of ground here, the history, the legal battles, the lasting impacts, and the connections to contemporary issues. But I think it's important to end this part of our deep dive by circling back to the human element. The PBS Post, while informative, can only provide a glimpse into the individual lives that were shattered by these programs.
Yeah, it's crucial to remember that behind the statistics and the legal precedents, there are real people who suffered immensely. People who were robbed of their bodily autonomy, their right to have children, their dignity, and their stories deserve to be heard and remembered.
Absolutely. We must honor their experiences and learn from their pain, and we must use this knowledge to fight for a future where such atrocities never happen again.
That's a powerful call to action, and one that I think we should all take to heart.
Indeed. It's a reminder that the fight for reproductive justice is ongoing, and we all have a role to play in ensuring that everyone has the right to control their own bodies and their own destinies.
Well said. And I know we've covered a lot of ground today, and I want to thank you for joining me on this deep dive into a truly dark chapter of American history. We'll continue this conversation in our next episode.
Picking up where we left off, I think it's important to acknowledge the psychological and emotional toll these programs took on individuals and communities.
Absolutely.
Right.
The PBS Post touches on this, highlighting the lasting trauma, the feelings of violation and the loss of control that many victims experienced. It's hard to imagine the pain and suffering they endured.
And these wounds were often compounded by shame and stigma. Many victims just felt silenced, afraid to speak out about what had happened to them.
That silence is so powerful, isn't it? It allows these injustices to continue, and it prevents healing.
Exactly. That's why it's so crucial to create safe spaces for survivors to share their stories and to receive the support they deserve. Breaking the silence is a crucial step towards justice and accountability.
And it's also about acknowledging the intergenerational trauma these programs have caused, the impact it ripples through families and communities for generations.
You're right. It's not just individual tragedies, but collective wounds that need collective healing. And that healing can only begin when we confront this history honestly and openly.
And when we work to dismantle the systems that made these atrocities possible in the first place.
Precisely. Now, so much of the conversation about reproductive rights focuses on the legal right to an abortion, but the Post reminds us that the fight for reproductive justice is much broader than that.
It's about access to quality health care, comprehensive sex education, and affordable reproductive services for everyone.
It's about empowering individuals to make informed decisions about their bodies and their families.
And it's about challenging the systems of oppression that have historically limited those choices for marginalized communities.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's a fight that demands attention to history, to policy, and to the lived experiences of those most affected.
The PBS Post doesn't go into a ton of detail about legal responses to these programs, but it does mention the Eugenics Compensation Act, which was passed in 2015.
Yes, that was a significant, though imperfect, attempt to provide some measure of justice to surviving victims of forced sterilization.
It's both a recognition of the harm done and a commitment to making amends, even if it can never fully erase the trauma.
And while financial compensation can never truly address the emotional and psychological damage inflicted, it's a step in the right direction. It acknowledges the government's role in perpetuating these injustices.
It also speaks to the ongoing work of advocates and organizations that are, pushing for accountability and change.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another disturbing incident mentioned in the post. The revelation in 2020 of forced sterilizations at an ICE detention center in Georgia.
It's a chilling reminder that these practices, even though officially condemned, can still occur, particularly within systems where power imbalances are rampant.
Exactly. It underscores the need for constant vigilance and accountability, especially within institutions that have a history of exploiting vulnerable populations.
And it reinforces the need to connect this historical context to present-day issues. The fight for reproductive justice isn't just about the past. It's about protecting the rights and bodily autonomy of all people in the present.
Now, beyond the specific instances of abuse, I think it's also important to consider the underlying philosophies that fueled these programs.
That's a great point. What were some of the key beliefs that drove the eugenics movement?
Well, at its core, eugenics was based on this idea that certain traits like poverty, intelligence, even criminality were inherited, and that they could be bred out of the population.
It's so flawed when you think about reducing complex social issues to simple genetics.
Absolutely. And this line of thinking often led to the scapegoating of marginalized groups, blaming them for societal problems, and using that as justification for controlling their reproduction.
And this wasn't just confined to academic circles, right? The Post talks about how these ideas were actually popularized in the media through books, articles, even exhibitions.
Yes, that's a crucial point. These weren't just fringe ideas. They were disseminated to the public and presented as scientific facts.
Which makes it even more insidious, right? When you have these harmful ideologies presented as legitimate science, it's easier for them to gain traction and influence policy.
Precisely. And we see echoes of this even today in debates around issues like genetics, intelligence, and social mobility.
It's a reminder that we need to be critical consumers of information.
Yeah.
And challenge any claims that rely on simplistic genetic explanations for complex social phenomena.
Couldn't agree more. And speaking of critical thinking, one point that struck me in the post was how financial incentives actually played a role in some of these programs.
It's almost hard to believe, isn't it? Doctors were actually given financial rewards for sterilizing people.
Yeah, it's a disturbing example of how these practices became entrenched in the medical system. It raises serious questions about the ethics of incentivizing medical procedures, especially when those procedures have such profound and potentially irreversible consequences.
It's a reminder that even within professions that are dedicated to healing, there's always potential for abuse, especially when vulnerable populations are involved.
And this brings us back to the importance of reproductive justice, of ensuring that everyone has access to health care that is ethical, informed, and truly centered on individual well-being.
It's about making sure that people have agency over their own bodies and their own reproductive choices, free from coercion or manipulation.
Exactly. And that means challenging any system or practice that undermines that agency, whether it's, overt coercion or more subtle forms of pressure or incentivization.
So, moving beyond the specific details of the PBS post, what are some key takeaways you think our listeners should keep in mind?
Well, first and foremost, it's crucial to remember that the history of forced sterilization is not just a distant event, but a legacy that continues to shape our present.
And it's a reminder that the fight for reproductive justice is far from over. We need to be vigilant in challenging any policies or practices that echo the harmful ideologies of the eugenics movement.
Absolutely. And that means looking beyond just the legal right to abortion and embracing a broader understanding of reproductive rights, one that encompasses access to quality health care, comprehensive sex education, and affordable reproductive services for all.
We need to be aware of the ways in which these issues intersect with race, class, and gender, and how they continue to disproportionately impact marginalized communities.
And finally, it's crucial to remember the human cost of these programs, to honor the experiences of those who suffered under them, and to learn from their pain.
We can't afford to forget this history, nor can we allow it to repeat itself. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to bring up one aspect of this topic that the PBS Post touches on: the ways in which the legacy of these programs continues to affect communities today.
Yes, that's an essential point. The trauma of forced sterilization can reverberate through generations, impacting family structures, community dynamics, and even access to healthcare.
The Post mentions that some communities, particularly those that were like heavily targeted by these programs, still experience like a deep mistrust of the medical system.
Absolutely. And this mistrust can have, real consequences, leading to delayed care, avoidance of preventative screenings, and even reluctance to seek help for reproductive health issues.
It's a tragic example of how the sins of the past can continue to cast a long shadow.
And it highlights the need for sensitivity and cultural awareness within the healthcare system, especially when working with communities that have experienced historical
I
trauma.
need to acknowledge and address this mistrust, building relationships based on respect, transparency, and shared decision making.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the power dynamics at play and working to create a healthcare system that is truly equitable and just. One thing that struck me in the post was the lack of discussion about the specific impact of these programs on Black women. I think it's crucial to acknowledge that Black women were disproportionately targeted by these programs.
You're absolutely right. The intersection of racism and sexism made Black women particularly vulnerable to these abuses. They were often seen as both like hyper fertile and unfit to parent, which led to their overrepresentation in sterilization programs.
And this targeting of Black women was often intertwined with efforts to control Black populations more broadly. It was about maintaining white supremacy and limiting the growth of Black communities.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder of how reproductive rights have always been a battleground for racial justice.
And it highlights the need to center the experiences of Black women in our conversations about reproductive justice. Their stories matter, and their voices need to be heard.
Absolutely. And we need to be aware of the ways in which these historical injustices continue to shape the reproductive health landscape for Black women today.
For instance, Black women still face significant disparities in access to quality healthcare, reproductive services, and even information about their reproductive options.
And they're also more likely to experience complications during pregnancy and childbirth, reflecting the systemic inequities that persist within the healthcare system.
It's a complex issue with deep historical roots, and it demands a multifaceted approach to achieve true reproductive justice for Black women.
Now, I know we've delved into some heavy material today, but I think it's important to end on a note of hope.
I agree. Despite the horrifying history we've discussed, there are glimmers of progress and reasons to be optimistic.
The fact that we're having this conversation, that there are organizations fighting for change, and that people are becoming more aware of these issues, it's a sign that things are moving in the right direction.
And there's a growing recognition of the importance of reproductive justice as a core human right.
It's about more than just access to abortion. It's about ensuring that everyone has the resources and the support they need to make informed decisions about their bodies and their families, free from coercion or discrimination.
And it's about creating a society where everyone's reproductive autonomy is respected and valued.
We still have a long way to go,
Yeah.
but the fight continues, and every voice raised in support of reproductive justice brings us one step closer to a more equitable and just world.
Well said. And with that in mind, I think it's time to shift gears a bit and explore a different facet of this topic.
That was good to me. What do you have in mind?
Well, the PBS post focuses primarily on the historical context of these programs, but I think it's also worth considering some of the modern ethical implications.
That's an excellent point. After all, we live in an era of rapid technological advancement, particularly in the fields of genetics and reproductive medicine. And with those advancements come new ethical challenges and questions.
Exactly. For instance, how do we ensure that these technologies are used responsibly and ethically without replicating the mistakes of the past?
It's a question that demands careful consideration.
And it raises a whole host of issues, such as, genetic testing, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, and even the potential for gene editing.
These are all like powerful tools with the potential for both immense good and potential harm. As we grapple with these new technologies, it's crucial to learn from the mistakes of the past.
The history of eugenics serves as a stark warning about the dangers of allowing prejudices and biases to influence our understanding of genetics and reproduction.
It's a reminder that we must be vigilant in safeguarding against the potential for discrimination and abuse, especially when dealing with technologies that have the power to shape the very fabric of human life.
It highlights the need for robust ethical guidelines and regulations, as well as ongoing public dialogue and debate. We need to approach these issues with humility, with caution, and a deep commitment to social justice.
It's about ensuring that these technologies are used to empower individuals, not to control or limit their choices.
Exactly. And with that, I think it's time to take a step back and explore one more aspect of this complex issue.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's next on our agenda?
Well, the PBS Post focuses primarily on the United States, but I think it's important to acknowledge that the history of forced sterilization is not limited to one country.
You're absolutely right. These practices have a global history,
Hmm.
with similar programs implemented in various countries throughout the 20th century.
And it's a reminder that the ideologies underpinning eugenics were not confined to one particular culture or nation. They were part of a broader trend of scientific racism and social control that spread across the globe.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how these ideas transcended like geographical boundaries.
Absolutely. And I think it's valuable to explore some of the international parallels and connections.
It helps us understand the broader context of this issue
Yeah.
and to recognize the shared responsibility we have in addressing it.
For instance, the Post mentions that Nazi Germany actually drew inspiration from U.S. sterilization laws when developing their own horrific eugenics program.
It's a chilling reminder of the global impact of these ideas and the devastating consequences they can have.
And it highlights the importance of international collaboration in addressing human rights violations, particularly those related to reproductive autonomy.
We need to learn from each other's histories, share best practices, and work together to create a world where everyone's reproductive rights are protected.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that this is a global issue that demands a global response.
Now, as we continue our exploration of this topic, I think it's important to acknowledge the voices of those who are most affected by these programs.
Absolutely. The PBS Post provides valuable historical context, but it's essential to center the experiences of those who were subjected to forced sterilization.
Their stories are powerful testimonies to the human cost of these policies, and they offer invaluable insights into the lasting trauma and resilience of survivors.
Sharing these stories is crucial not only for historical understanding, but also for fostering empathy and promoting social change.
The Post mentions that there are numerous books, documentaries, and articles that delve deeper into the personal narratives of those who were sterilized.
And many organizations are working to collect oral histories and create platforms for survivors to share their experiences.
Yeah, it's important for us to seek out these resources and listen attentively to the voices of those who were silenced for so long.
Their stories have the power to challenge our assumptions, deepen our understanding, and inspire us to take action.
I couldn't agree more. Now, as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm struck by the sheer scale of the injustice we've been discussing.
It's truly overwhelming, isn't it? The number of lives affected, the generations impacted, the systemic nature of these programs, it's almost too much to comprehend.
And yet it's essential that we grapple with the full weight of this history.
Well,
We can't afford to look away or to minimize the suffering that occurred.
you're absolutely right. Acknowledging the full scope of the injustice is crucial for both accountability and healing.
And it's a reminder that the fight for reproductive justice is not over. We need to be vigilant in challenging any policies or practices that echo the harmful ideologies of the past.
We need to be mindful of the ways in which these issues continue to play out in the present, particularly for marginalized communities who still face significant barriers to reproductive autonomy.
And we need to be committed to creating a future where everyone's reproductive rights are respected, protected, and celebrated.
Well said. On that note, I think it's time to shift gears and explore one final and perhaps most important aspect of this complex issue.
I'm all ears. What's next on our agenda?
Well, we've talked extensively about the historical and social dimensions of forced sterilization, but I think it's crucial to also consider the ethical implications.
You're absolutely right. At its core, the practice of forced sterilization raises fundamental questions about bodily autonomy, human dignity, and the right to self-determination.
Exactly. It represents a profound violation of individual rights, and It challenges our very notions of what it means to be human.
And while these programs may be a thing of the past in many countries, the ethical questions they raise are still relevant today.
Absolutely. For instance, we need to be vigilant in ensuring that any medical procedures, especially those related to reproduction, are performed with informed consent and with full respect for individual autonomy.
And we need to be mindful of the potential for coercion, particularly within systems where power imbalances exist, such as prisons, detention centers, or even within families.
We also need to be critical of any ideologies or practices that seek to control or limit reproductive choices based on social status, economic background, or any other arbitrary factors.
It's about recognizing that reproductive autonomy is a fundamental human right that should be protected and upheld for all individuals.
Precisely. And with that in mind, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive and leave our listener with some final thoughts to ponder.
Okay, what would you like to leave our listener with?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's crucial to remember that the history of forced sterilization is not just a distant event, but a legacy that continues to shape our present.
And it's a reminder that the fight for reproductive justice is far from over. We need to be vigilant in challenging any policies or practices that echo the harmful ideologies of the eugenics movement.
Absolutely. And that means looking beyond just the legal right to abortion and embracing a broader understanding of reproductive rights, one that encompasses access to quality health care, comprehensive sex education, and affordable reproductive services for all.
We need to be aware of the ways in which these issues intersect with race, class, and gender, and how they continue to disproportionately impact marginalized communities.
And finally, it's crucial to remember the human cost of these programs, to honor the experiences of those who suffered under them, and to learn from their pain.
We can't afford to forget this history, nor can we allow it to repeat itself.
So we've talked about the ethical dimensions, the global reach, the individual stories. It's a lot to unpack.
It really is.
Mm.
And I think it's natural to feel overwhelmed by the sheer scale of this injustice.
Yeah.
You know, it can be tempting to distance ourselves from it, to think of it as a relic of the past.
So, but I think that's precisely what we need to resist. It's easy to condemn these practices in hindsight, but the real challenge is to ensure that we're not repeating the same mistakes in different forms.
Yeah, that's such an important point. We need to be constantly questioning our assumptions, our biases, and the systems we operate within to make sure that we're not perpetuating these harmful ideologies, even unintentionally.
It's about being aware of the ways in which power operates and challenging any systems that disenfranchise or dehumanize certain groups.
So I think that's one of those valuable takeaways from this PBS post. You know, it's not just about learning about a specific historical event, but about developing a critical lens through which to view the present.
It's about recognizing the patterns of oppression that have existed throughout history and understanding how those patterns continue to manifest in different ways.
Exactly. We need to be vigilant in challenging any policies or practices that echo the ideologies of eugenics, even if they're presented in a more subtle or sanitized form.
And I think that's where the concept of reproductive justice becomes so crucial. It's about moving beyond just the legal right to abortion and recognizing the full spectrum of reproductive rights and freedoms.
It's about ensuring that everyone has access to the resources and the support they need to make informed decisions about their bodies and their families, free from coercion or discrimination.
It's about dismantling the systems of oppression that have historically limited those choices for marginalized communities.
And ultimately, it's about creating a world where everyone's reproductive autonomy is respected and valued.
Beautifully said.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listener with a few final thoughts. First, I encourage you to delve deeper into this topic. The PBS post is a great starting point, but there are countless other resources available to help you expand your understanding.
And don't be afraid to engage in difficult conversations with your friends, family, and community. Silence only perpetuates these injustices.
Talk about what you've learned, share your insights, and challenge harmful beliefs wherever you encounter them.
And most importantly, take action. Support organizations that are fighting for reproductive justice, advocate for policies that protect bodily autonomy, and use your voice to demand a more equitable and just world.
those are powerful words, and I think they perfectly encapsulate the message of this deep dive. It's not enough to simply be aware of these issues. We have a responsibility to act, to speak out, and to work towards a future where everyone's reproductive rights are truly protected.
Yeah. It's a fight that requires constant vigilance and collective action, but it's a fight worth having for the sake of ourselves, our communities, and future generations.
I couldn't agree more. And on that note, I want to thank you for joining me on this deep dive. It's been a heavy but essential conversation.
The pleasure was all mine. It's always a privilege to engage in these discussions and to learn from each other.
And to our listener, thank you for tuning in. We hope this deep dive has been informative, thought-provoking, and perhaps even a little bit inspiring. We'll see you next time.